Why? Because it's my birthday.
What makes a person change beyond recognition, and what keeps another trapped in the same darkness, no matter how desperately they fight it? The Lord of the Rings is filled with heroes, but its most haunting tragedy rests on the shoulders of one forgotten hobbit, Smeagol, a creature torn between two selves, one pleading for mercy, the other hungry for power. He is both pitiful and vicious, loyal yet treacherous, clever but broken, a wanderer who is never alone and yet utterly isolated, a victim of corruption, also an agent of it, fragile and dangerous. With all these contradictions at war inside him and the ring pulling every thread tighter, the unavoidable question becomes, was Gollum ever truly capable of redemption, or was he doomed the moment he first touched the ring? Foundations of a fragile self. Smeagol before the ring. To understand Gollum's eventual fragmentation, we must begin with Smeagol, not as an innocent victim, but as a mind already carrying vulnerabilities the ring would later exploit. Smeagol is curious, intensely perceptive, and drawn toward things hidden beneath the surface. But beneath that curiosity lies a deeper trait, a strong sensitivity to rejection and a desire for belonging that often goes unmet. These tendencies do not make him destined for corruption, but they do create psychological openings, small fractures that pressure can widen. His relationship with Smeagol shows this clearly. Smeagol's attachment is marked by dependence more than equality. He looks outward for emotional grounding rather than inward for stability. Individuals with such dispositions often experience internal conflict when faced with sudden deprivation or threat, and this helps explain why what happens next hits him with such force. Smeagol also exhibits a personality inclined toward fixation. Small curiosities easily become obsessions, and discomfort lingers longer in him than in others. This trait, harmless on its own, becomes dangerous when paired with an object engineered to dominate the will. Before the ring ever enters his life, Smeagol is a person shaped by longing, sensitivity, and an intense inner life. None of these traits condemn him, but they do make him unusually susceptible to something powerful enough to rewrite identity itself. The groundwork for the fracture has been laid long before the first whisper of the ring reaches him. The first break. How corruption enters the mind. The moment Smeagol encounters the ring is not simply a turn toward darkness. It is the first visible break in a mind already shaped by longing and sensitivity. The murder of Smeagol is shocking, but it is not random. Psychologically, this moment reveals three defining truths about Smeagol and the force that ensnares him. First, the ring does not create evil out of nothing. It amplifies what already exists: desire, insecurity, the craving for significance. For someone as impressionable as Smeagol, this amplification is overwhelming. The ring becomes not just an object, but a mirror reflecting back his deepest, least controlled impulses. Second, Smeagol's need for possession overrides his capacity to bond. The conflict between affection and control appears instantly, and in the first true test of loyalty, he chooses control. This is not merely moral failure, it is psychological collapse. The ring offers certainty and worth, things Smeagol has always struggled to secure through relationships. Third, the split begins immediately. The murder fractures his identity. The part of him capable of genuine affection dies with Smeagol, and the part capable of obsession rushes to fill the void. He does not yet speak to himself in two voices, but the division is already forming, a defensive partition meant to contain the unbearable weight of what he has done. This is the true beginning of Gollum, not in the caves, not in the centuries of decay, but here, the moment desire eclipses selfhood and a mind starts to divide. Exile and erosion, how isolation reshapes the mind. Smeagol's transformation does not begin in solitude, it begins in the eyes of the people around him. After the murder of Smeagol, his community reacts not with understanding, but with fear, revulsion, and rejection. Their perception of him shifts instantly, and this shift becomes a psychological wound. He is no longer seen as a troubled member of the group, but as something aberrant, dangerous, other. For someone already sensitive to belonging, this loss of recognition is devastating. Their rejection reinforces the shame he is unwilling to face. When a community withdraws its acceptance, the individual often withdraws in turn, not out of defiance, but out of self-protection. Smeagol retreats because every gaze mirrors back the act he cannot undo. What begins as social distancing becomes internal retreat, creating the perfect conditions for psychological erosion. In isolation, everything accelerates. Without social regulation, emotions and thoughts intensify unchecked. Rumination deepens. Fixations harden. Behaviors that would once have been softened or challenged by others now spiral freely. His speech begins to fragment because no one remains to reinforce shared meaning. His posture, habits, and even his sense of time distort as the outside world grows dim and the ring becomes his primary point of reference. Meanwhile, those who once knew him come to see his changes as confirmation that he has become something monstrous. Their perception, fearful, dismissive, pushes him further into the caves and further into himself. Isolation does not simply reshape Smeagol, it completes the separation between who he was and who he is becoming. A mind in chains, addiction, dependency, and the collapse of self. By the time Smeagol disappears into the dark, the ring has become more than an object of desire. It has become the organizing principle of his psychology. Addiction, in its purest form, is not about pleasure, but about survival. The mind reorients itself around the substance or object it depends on, and the ring functions with frightening precision in this role. It offers validation, control, and a sense of significance that Smeagol cannot access anywhere else. Psychologically, the ring acts as a parasitic attachment figure. The more Smeagol relies on it, the more his selfhood contracts, narrowing to accommodate the compulsive bond. His emotional world simplifies. Threats become anything that endangers the ring, and safety becomes anything that protects it. Over time, this dependency reshapes his perception of reality, making the ring not just important, but essential, a requirement for psychological stability. Withdrawal drives the collapse even further. Moments when the ring is absent, whether physically or emotionally, trigger panic, aggression, or despair. These symptoms are not random. They are the predictable consequences of an attachment so complete that Smeagol can no longer distinguish between what he wants and what he is. The ring speaks and he obeys because his identity has fused with the object that replaced his sense of self. This is the stage where the fracture deepens. The groundwork for dissociation has been laid through isolation, shame, and fixation. Addiction seals it. Smeagol is no longer a person wrestling with a burden. He is becoming the burden's expression. The fracturing of identity, Smeagol and the emergence of Gollum. Gollum's evolution and his ultimate unraveling cannot be understood without recognizing one pivotal psychological event. The moment Smeagol's mind fractures into two competing identities. His self-dialogues aren't just quirks or dramatic flourishes. They are windows into a psyche under unbearable strain, forced to divide in order to survive. Smeagol doesn't create Gollum because he is inherently wicked. He creates Gollum because the ring demands a form of loyalty his original self cannot consistently uphold. The internal tension becomes intolerable, and the mind resolves the conflict the only way it can, by generating a second self that carries the weight of the addiction. Gollum becomes the persona optimized for serving the ring, free from guilt, free from doubt, free from the burden of remembering who he used to be. In psychological terms, it is a dissociative split born from trauma and dependency. Each identity rises and falls in direct response to environmental triggers. When Smeagol experiences trust, gentleness, or the possibility of belonging, the original self resurfaces. When he encounters fear, humiliation, or betrayal, the Gollum side takes control. These shifts are not random. They are precise cause and effect patterns, the mind protecting itself by switching to whichever self can best endure the moment. This is the core tragedy of Smeagol. His healthier identity can only survive in an environment of safety, and such conditions are almost never granted to him. The world repeatedly reinforces his deepest wounds: mistrust, rejection, powerlessness, pushing him back into the very form shaped by the ring. The split isn't a narrative device or a symbolic transformation. It is a psychological necessity, the only mechanism that allows him to continue existing beneath the weight of a burden no single unified self could endure. A brief return to self, the conditional possibility of redemption. The emergence of Smeagol's gentler self during the journey with Frodo is often viewed as a moral turning point. Still, psychologically, it reflects something deeper: the temporary reactivation of an identity long suppressed but not entirely erased. Even fractured psyches contain dormant parts of the original self, and under specific conditions, safety, trust, and recognition, these parts can surface again. Frodo provides something Smeagol has not experienced in centuries: a relationship not defined by fear or dominance. When Frodo speaks to him with respect, calling him by his true name, he offers a form of interpersonal validation that Smeagol's mind had been starved of. This is not sentimentality, it is a psychological mechanism. Identity is reinforced through connection, and for a fleeting period, Smeagol experiences enough stability to reclaim fragments of who he once was. But this recovery is fragile. It relies entirely on external conditions, because Smeagol no longer possesses the internal coherence to maintain it alone. His healthier self is not a fully restored identity. It is a remnant, awakened temporarily because the environment allows it. When shown trust, he becomes capable of loyalty. When given gentleness, he responds with vulnerability. These shifts show that redemption is not impossible, it is conditional. Yet the very delicacy of this transformation foreshadows its collapse. A psyche built on trauma and dissociation cannot sustain integration without consistent reinforcement, and Middle-earth is not a world that offers such constancy. Smeagol's redemption is real, but it is also painfully unstable, triggering the regression, betrayal, and the re-emergence of Gollum. Smeagol's fragile recovery begins to shatter the moment he is confronted by suspicion, force, and humiliation, conditions that mirror the earliest wounds of his exile. When Faramir's men capture and torment him, they unknowingly recreate the psychological environment that originally drove him inward and downward. For a mind held together by the thinnest thread of conditional trust, this moment functions as a powerful trigger. The progress he has made is not undone slowly, it collapses instantly. What happens here is not simply emotional pain, it is regression, a return to the identity most capable of protecting him. Gollum reemerges not as a villainous choice, but as a defensive structure, a self-optimized for survival under threat. Where Smeagol responds to trust, Gollum responds to fear. Where Smeagol seeks connection, Gollum seeks control. The betrayal confirms his deepest, most corrosive belief, that vulnerability leads only to harm. Frodo's inability to shield him, though not intentional, reinforces this fracture. To Smeagol, it feels like abandonment. The part of him that responded to compassion shrinks, and the part shaped by years of isolation expands to fill the space. The dialogue between Smeagol and Gollum becomes less negotiation and more takeover. The defensive self consolidates power. From a psychological standpoint, this is the moment redemption becomes nearly impossible. Not because Smeagol chooses corruption, but because his environment confirms the worldview that created Gollum in the first place. Mount Doom, the final act of a broken mind. By the time Frodo, Sam, and Gollum reach Mount Doom, the journey is no longer about survival or loyalty. It is about identity. Smeagol is barely present now, flickering like a dying candle. Gollum, fueled by obsession and centuries of self-destruction, takes full control. At the cracks of doom, Tolkien gives us the most devastating truth of Gollum's story. The ring is the only thing in the world that has ever made him feel whole. So when Frodo claims the ring for himself, Gollum doesn't see betrayal. He sees annihilation. The precious is not just a treasure. It is his last connection to meaning, purpose, and the person he once was. Without it, there is nothing left inside him worth saving. What follows is not merely an attack. It is a desperate, instinctual act of self-preservation. As Gollum bites off Frodo's finger and clutches the ring with ecstatic joy, Tolkien writes that he dances on the brink of ruin, lost in a mad delight. In that moment, we see the final truth. Gollum has not chosen death. He has chosen the only life he understands. When he falls into the fire, still holding the ring with adoration, it is not the death of a villain. It is the tragic, inevitable end of a fractured mind whose last shred of self was bound to its own destruction. Smeagol dies, Gollum dies, and the ring dies with them. Gollum does not die because he is evil. He dies because no fractured self can endure once the obsession holding it together disappears. And this forces us to confront the question Tolkien leaves deliberately unresolved. How much of Gollum's fate was his fault, and how much was he doomed to from the moment he touched the ring? If you want to explore how Tolkien crafts characters whose inner struggles become their destinies, watch how Tolkien created one of the greatest tragic heroes of all time.